before we get into where we are today, let's take a step back. Some of the policies that guide our system today were created 20, 30, 40 years ago. Tell us the environment of where we were in the criminal justice system then, and what's changed.
I'm told I was invited here to provide historical perspective. And in our society, you realize that's not entirely a compliment. when you say of someone that he's history, it generally means that he's yesterday's news or the day before. But nonetheless, I think it's useful for us to understand how it is that we got here. And I do, in fact, date back to what are virtually biblical times in criminal justice, before there existed any sentencing guidelines. I actually sentenced defendants with no sentencing guidelines. The only limit was 0 to whatever the maximum was. Those are known to some judges, actually mostly deceased judges at this point, but known to some judges as the proverbial good old days. In fact, there were enormous abuses under the surface. And those abuses actually became the subject of a very thin volume by a judge named Marvin Frankel, who sat on the court that I later sat on, a book called The Crime of Sentencing, in which he recounted a number of anecdotes, including various things that people said over lunch in the judge's dining room. For example, a judge who came in and said, I had a defendant this morning, I was going to give him 5 years. And the SOB got up and started berating me and talking about how unfair his trial was, so I tacked on another 5. As he pointed out, the poor defendant never knew it. It was that unlimited, and there was virtually no appeal from any sentence, so long as it was within the range. There were mandatory minimums, to be sure, but that was pretty much it. Now, that was somewhat mitigated by the fact that there existed at the time also something called parole. That is, after service of usually about a third of a sentence, a defendant could be considered for release. And so that in addition to being rather arbitrary, sentencing was in essence false, because a judge would get up and say, I'm committing you to the custody of the Attorney General as authorized representative for a period of 10 or 15 or whatever it was. And of course the defendant would be out in a third of that, generally. And so the sentencing system didn't even keep that promise. As the senator said in his prepared remarks, the civil asset forfeiture, that dates back even further than I do. That dates back to the law of deodans in ancient England, in which if a carriage rode over somebody and killed him, it would be forfeited to the king and destroyed. That's what civil asset forfeiture is about. It is that primitive and counterintuitive. So, as I said, Marvin Frankel wrote this book. He wrote it in the 1970s, and we got something called the Civil Justice Reform Act of 1984. Now, I understand that the new statute is also called the Reform Act, and that's fine. But I got to tell you that when I hear the word reform attached to a piece of legislation, I reach ever so quietly for a revolver. Because generally, legislation that is called reform creates at least as many problems as it solves, if not more. And I think that the passage of the sentencing guidelines was no exception. It was a document of hundreds of pages. It featured a chart in which there were some 40-odd levels of seriousness of the offense, the degree to which somebody had ripped the social fabric, and 5 levels of personal history, and you just went down the left-hand side, the seriousness of the offense, and across the top, and where they met was the sentence. And it seemed to promise precision, and it seemed to promise uniformity, so you got rid of the notion of there being lenient judges and harsh judges. But of course it promised more than it gave, because the appearance of precision was totally belied by the fact that, and nobody talked about this at the time, that the determination of what those numbers were was based on the sentences that had been passed under the old system. So what they did is to take kind of the lowest common denominator of all the arbitrary sentences that judges have given out over the years and codify them in the sentencing guidelines. And it looked very precise. In fact, if you looked at that chart, it looked kind of like a railroad timetable. I expected to see whether one section had a dining car. It also transformed sentencing, both the imposition of sentence and the degree to which people were willing to plead guilty. Before the guidelines were passed, it was said that nobody would plead guilty because they were so harsh. In fact, the opposite was true. Some cynics said that the guidelines gave the criminal classes what they always crave, which is certainty. You could tell precisely what you were going to get if you pleaded guilty, and precisely what you were going to get if you went to trial. They also transformed the sentencing itself into what looked like a meeting of some occult club. You would walk in and you would hear somebody saying, "Is this a 2L 1.2?" Nah, I think it's more like a 1B 4.3. And of course, the defendant had no idea what was going on. His family had no idea what was going on. But at the end of it, out came a number. I think what that concealed, and what we have to face up to, is that, let's face it, sentencing is inherently arbitrary. You take human action and assign it a number of value, and then take that number of value and transform it into a deprivation of liberty for a period of time. Now, I understand that sentencing has certain goals. It has a goal of general deterrence, specific deterrence, rehabilitation, punishment, of course, and protection of society. And all of those punishments, all of those standards are articulated by judges every time they pass sentence. But in point of fact, there is no data that can support the degree to which any sentence contributes to any of those goals. And what we need, I think, is, number one, data-driven information in order to determine what we do when we sentence. And number two, an understanding of the degree to which particularly the high-end sentences add to our protection. I don't think they do. I've seen no study at all of the incremental value that's gained by an extra 5 years on a 10 or 15-year sentence. By contrast, of course, there is a lot of data on how enormously expensive it is to keep aging prisoners, and the degree, the level of resource allocation that you need in order to maintain a jail system in which those people are held. So we need the data, and we need to act on it. Just one more point, and then I'm going to surrender the floor. We also need to evaluate information along levels that are targeted at particular defendants, and that may involve making some fairly distasteful distinctions. I heard people talk about gender equality. Let me tell you a little story. I visited when I was on the district court, I visited a federal prison, actually not far from here, that housed 450 women. And the warden gave me one of the most alarming statistics I ever heard. He said, "You know how many visits the 450 prisoners in this facility had during Christmas week? 2. You want to know why? Because women visit men in jail, and men don't visit women." Now, I think that's got to be transformed into reality and into an understanding of precisely how things function. That's true not only of gender distinctions, it's true of other distinctions as well. But we need to talk about reality here, and not simply about abstractions. And sentencing, when I was on the bench, was driven entirely by abstractions, and I think that when you have a guideline system, it's driven by different abstractions, but abstractions nonetheless. Thanks very much.
Judge, it seems that law enforcement is looking at this issue differently. The attorney generals, sheriffs, police chiefs, even the former U.S. attorney on the panel, he brought up data-driven. Why do you think that law enforcement is looking at this differently now? Is it data-driven? Is it another reason?
I think people involved in law enforcement have started realizing, and it's about time, that they are seeing a constant repetition of the same patterns over and over again, without things getting any better. They're seeing the same people, they're seeing the same patterns. If the criminal justice system is supposed to have any kind of transformative effect, it ain't working. And they need to see that. And so they are open to change in a way that I think they never were.
So it ain't working. Why are you a supporter of criminal justice reform? Is it a particular case, something else?
It's the net of all the cases that I had, and the realization that with all the solemn pronouncements that I made, there were a number of cases in which I believe that we did protect society. I mean, the terrorism case you mentioned, we put people in for, in one case, life. And I'm happy to say that that defendant kept his end of the bargain and served the entire sentence. He passed away several months ago. Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman was one of the most dangerous human beings in the world. I thought he should never see the light of day, and he was actually blind, so he likely to see the light of day. You get the point. He should never be allowed to roam free, and he wasn't. But there are very few people who fit that category.
Thanks, Judge. Judge Reynolds, one thing that wasn't mentioned in your bio, and what you and I share, is we both clerked for a Chief Justice. I clerked for Chief Justice Lambert. You clerked for his predecessor, Chief Justice Stevens. In that position, you've also been a judge, and I've appeared before you a number of times, and I wouldn't say you were hot. You were always even and always very tough. I better have my stuff together, and so better my client. So as the former judge, former CEO, current CEO of Urban League, you've witnessed a lot of how the system affects families, especially people of color. Tell us what's working, and I guess more importantly, what's not working in Louisville and in Kentucky.
Well, so I'm very thankful to be here tonight. Actually, that's not really true. I didn't want to do this. And the dean said, listen, you got to do it. And Jason, you said, you got to do this. And so I'm here, and it is a good thing to see people crossing the aisle and being willing to work on criminal justice reform. That is really important. I think sometimes, though, we get to be a little bit too celebratory, and we're thinking that we have really made some strides that we really haven't. We've got to be very, very careful about patting ourselves on the back too much. I think folks are to be commended. The National Urban League, the local Urban League, and others. I mean, we're trying hard to find partners, unlikely partners, and sometimes you agree to this much, and then you hope that the next time you can go a little bit further. And I think that we have to recognize that. I appreciate the judge's comments that, in fact, it ain't working. There's so much that is not working, and we can talk about it, and I think it's important for us to talk about criminal justice reform and sentencing reform, but we've also got to think about how do we prevent people from going into prison in the first place. In my work, what I see so often is that we like to have in our society these very siloed conversations. We think we can talk about criminal justice reform without talking about education reform, without talking about housing, without talking about some of the deprivations that people of color especially have had in this country. There's no way to separate that. When you look at negative outcomes, you have to look at all of those root cause things. So to the extent that we are moving the needle some, we are working together, we are finding things positive to align ourselves, I say kudos to us. But I think we have to do more of that in more areas if we're really going to move things forward. When I think about reentry, think about what that's like for someone who is coming home, they've paid their dues to society, and we're still talking about whether or not they can enter the workplace. They have children. If you think about the number of women who are incarcerated now, those numbers are going up, and what's happening to families. What are we doing on the front end? We are much too smart a country to be so reactive and waiting for that end. What we really need to be doing is working more on the front end, and I think that's important for us. And it's hard for me not to say that in a room full of very intelligent, I believe, law students. I'm a graduate of the University of Louisville and also the University of Kentucky Law School. And so I would challenge all of us to really go further. And I really feel like that's what a lot of what the judge is saying. You have to understand that this system isn't working. Parole is not really a mitigation if you've got somebody who never should have been incarcerated in the first place. And I think that especially for African Americans, I say, we really do need in this country a humanization project. Because I think it is very easy when you don't see someone always as just another human being. It's very easy to allow certain sentences to just go on. I mean, and if you think that the story that was told about someone saying, you know, this person's ticked me off and we added 5 years, if something like that isn't still happening, and it's not just necessarily happening on the bench, but it happens before somebody walks into a courtroom. So we need reform that recognizes that we all walk around with our own biases and our own set of privileges. So how do we do that? How do we use that in a way that really acknowledges what is broken in our system and in our country? And that cannot be a siloed approach.
Thank you for that. One of the things you said that struck, you said a lot there that I think is important. One of the things you said was that we need a humanization project. A humanization project. One of the things that we passed in Kentucky, first state to do it, is the Dignity Bill. And we heard a little bit about what that was. Is that important? Does it really make a difference, or is it just a pat on the back type of thing? Why is it important if it is?
I mean, I have given birth to 2 children. I've been in labor for 20 some odd hours with one of them, and the idea of being shackled at that time is just, it is, somebody said earlier, you would never even imagine that something like that would be happening. That being said, so, I mean, yeah, it's unbelievable that anybody would ever even think that there would be a need for such a thing, right? Where is any exercise of common sense? Where is any exercise? How, we cannot continue to think that there is a criminal class in this country. It is the grace of God that separates a lot of us, because people sometimes have to make really bad choices. The other part of it is, and we had this in Kentucky, right? We have a case in Kentucky where we have 3, at least maybe 2 students, I don't remember if it was 2 or 3 in Lexington, who were apparently drug trafficking, paying a mule, who was coming back. And long story short, listen, they torture this guy, hold him in the basement in $1 million house, and they get probated. That's, okay, I don't know, I am not opposed to second chances. I have served this community as a public defender. I have served as a district court judge. I am now president of the Urban League, and I believe people deserve second chances. What we have to understand as we reform is that I want the same justice for me as a woman, for me as a black woman, that you would want for your mother, for your sister. And that's what we have to do. That's what I mean by humanization, and that's what I think about dignity. I want the dignity that you would want for someone who you cared about, who was addicted. I look back and wonder, what do we learn about how we treated crack addicts in this country when we thought that we were going to imprison everybody and work our way out of it in that way. And then opioid came along, right? And we have this addiction. And the shade of the person who is addicted has changed. And our response is different. We don't even have conversations about how much we're spending on Narcan. What does a life cost? Well, it depends. What does that person look like? So the Dignity Bill is important, but we cannot stop there. And so kudos to us for doing this, but I mean, we should celebrate this night, this moment, and tomorrow get back to work together. Because we are, Judge, all in this together.
Judge, you mentioned there's a lot of law students here tonight, and you challenged them. Okay, put some meat on those bones. What can they do? We leave here tonight. They're riled up. They've heard from a great panel. They've heard from City Equal Rentals. What can they do?
Well, I think there are good organizations doing good work. It would be crazy for me not to talk about the Urban League, right? We're doing wonderful work. The National Urban League on the local level doing wonderful work. We don't have enough of a focus on policy. We have some phenomenal programs. We do some policy work. You must have the policy work. You must support organizations like ours to do the policy change that is needed. Same for the ACLU and other organizations. We have to have that. I think we have to be intelligent about reform, and you don't wait until you are a victim or your family member. We have to have some real reform and intelligent conversation about getting out of these silos and understanding how things are connected and focusing on some root causes of what has happened in this country and what happens when that happens. I think that's really important for us, and where we can find common ground, I think we have to do that. I'm hoping that these law students will be better at that than we are right now in this country. I mean, I don't think we're setting very good examples for our students right now, but hopefully they will be better than we have been, as every, hopefully, generation usually is.
Thank you, City Equal. Brett, as U.S. Attorney for Utah, one of the things you may be best known as is the person who prosecuted the kidnappers of Elizabeth Smart. Recently, it's been in the news that one of her kidnappers is looking to be released at 8 years when she was sentenced to 15-year term. And Elizabeth is very concerned about that, and you joined her. So how do you square your position with standing with Elizabeth Smart, saying that the kidnapper should serve more time, with what we're talking about here today, and your position on reforming?
Well, thanks. It's an honor to be here. I'm very grateful for the chance to be with Judge Reynolds and the Attorney General, who was my boss, and I always try to behave when I'm around him. He was
Good policy.
Indeed my favorite boss. Very grateful to him. Taught me so much as a young U.S. attorney who looked even younger. Grateful for Congressman Chaffetz being here. He was the first legislator that listened to us and said, yeah, I want to change the system. For me, I want to give you, before I address the issue of the kidnappers of Elizabeth Smart, I give you my background real quickly. I grew up in a home with a father who was in law enforcement in LA. I grew up with a sister who, she was a security guard, and she loved to run down bad guys and would literally run them down and tackle them in parking lots and stuff. And so I grew up with that sort of family, very law and order family. And then something happened when I was 12 years old. My sister was kidnapped and raped in college, and it devastated our family. For the first time, crime hit our family in a way that we kind of hadn't experienced before. So when I went to law school, I wanted to be a prosecutor. I wanted to put bad guys in jail, and I did. And I became a federal prosecutor, and I was that for about a decade. I became the U.S. attorney. President Bush made me the U.S. attorney. And one of the cases that was languishing was the Elizabeth Smart kidnapping case, and it had languished about 5 years in the state system with no convictions. Now, I don't know about you, but it seemed to me like that was one we could get a conviction on. It seemed pretty cut and dried, and these were two individuals who kidnapped her out of her home when she was young and took her, and the moment that she was kidnapped, they began to rape her. And both participated in it, and they raped her multiple times. So you can imagine, as a community, we wanted to be as harsh or as justified under the law to punish. Now, Brian David Mitchell was the most culpable, and I am proud to say that we worked very hard to prove that he was faking, that he was incompetent. He was convicted, and he will serve the rest of his life. And like Judge McCasey, I believe that he will immediately reoffend if he were to be out. That it is in his nature and his DNA right now to kidnap, to rape, and he would be a problem. Wanda Barzee was a bigger question mark, and I knew that at some point she would be released sooner than even Elizabeth would want. It happened even sooner than people realized because she got credit for some time in the mental house, mental institution that nobody anticipated. But if you look at what Elizabeth's comments were, and I think this is powerful, she gave a statement that said that she had forgiven Wanda Barzee, if you can imagine. Her issue with her was that during her incarceration, she chose not to partake in any mental health treatment. And it was that incensed her and frustrated me, and really, I think, promoted our comments, which were, I'd be fine if she had participated and was willing to participate in that when she got out, because then I would feel better about her not being as much a potential problem. So for me, I'm in criminal justice reform because of what happened in the past, but also as a federal prosecutor, I wielded tremendous power. And with all due respect to Judge McCasey, there are times that maybe he's even felt prosecutors wielded more power than he did when it came to sentencing under the new system. And we felt that. I have individuals that are, and I'll tell you why real simply. If it's drugs, well, we're gonna calculate it based on all the amount of drugs, and we're gonna base your sentence in the federal system by the amount and what you could make from that amount. If it's money and fraud, we're gonna base it on all the intended loss It doesn't matter if you actually stole only $1,000. If you intended to steal $2 million, we'll sentence you on $2 million. So the federal system, they started aggravating and they started adding, and pretty soon you have no parole, and you have a system that has decades and decades where an individual is going to serve, where the equivalent in the state system would maybe be 2 or 3 years. So the equilibrium swung the other way, and it swung in the wrong direction. I got involved because I started looking at some states. Kentucky's one of them, Texas, Georgia. They started doing things different. They started recognizing that 95% of all inmates get out. Do you want them to get out without that mental health treatment like Wanda Barzee? Do you want them to get out without training or some education so that they can avoid being recidivists? So we avoid that? Or do you just want them getting out? Because right now the federal system is devoid. There's very little to take advantage of, and there's very little incentive to lower that risk of recidivism. So that First Step Act that's been talked about is that it is adding, based on the states who have done this. Texas closed 4 prisons, saved $4 billion plus. How did they do it? They just started giving programming, education, training, and then assessing recidivism. And then if you lowered your risk of recidivism, they said, hey, we'll let you out early. It seemed too simple and too easy, but it worked. And so now we're trying to do it on the federal level. And boy, you know, based on tonight, I thought maybe the Attorney General of the United States was in charge of the lighting or something, because I'm sure he doesn't want criminal justice reform right now. I wish that General Casey was still the Attorney General right now, because I think he was a man of incredible integrity and honesty when it came to the criminal justice system. And that decades old, let's just be tough on crime, it might have got some people elected 10, 20, 30 years ago, but that's all it did. And otherwise, all it's doing is warehousing people. And those people are our family members and our friends, and they're getting it out.
Britt, we've talked a little bit about the First Step Act. Earlier this year, it passed the U.S. House with unprecedented, maybe not unprecedented, but seemingly unprecedented in the world we live in today, bipartisan margins of 360 to 59. We've heard a little bit, it's pending before the Senate. Maybe Senator McConnell will call it for a vote. Hopefully he will. What's in the bill? You talked just very briefly about it. What's in the bill? What does it do? What does it not do? And why is it important for the federal system?
So, for truth serum in me, if you say, you know, this is the most incredible criminal justice reform bill, I just kind of laugh at you. And the reason I laugh at you is because it's so basic, so modest, it's embarrassing we can't get it done. And when I say modest, let's take the 4,000 people that are going to get out immediately. You would think that it's, you know, all hell breaking loose and there's, you know, all kinds of bad people are going to be let out of the system. Well, guess what? These 4,000 people are individuals that under the statute were entitled to get out sooner. But because the Bureau of Prisons calculates their earned time different, you get 54 days per year, up to 54 days per year off if you're good. But the Bureau of Prisons was only given 47 days. So what this does is it fixes that mathematical problem. So to me, when you say it's monumental criminal justice reform, yes, it is. It's needed. We should be beyond that, right? So that's one aspect of it. The other is the compassionate and elderly release changes. I have a client that I got a call 2 weeks ago. He's dying. He has cancer. It's all throughout his whole body. He's 40-some-odd years old. And there really wasn't any mechanism for getting him out and doing it quickly. So I finally just called the prosecutor on the case, who I was his boss as U.S. attorney, and I said, get this done. I said, I don't care if I'm not your boss anymore. I'll remember this the rest of my life. With his help, we got it done in 2 weeks. We got him out. So that human factor is very important. The First Step Act, I think, makes very modest changes to lower recidivism when they get out. We are hoping to have some changes on the front end that fix, I think, malfunctions in the federal statutes. And then it does things like fixing that 47 versus 54 days and things of that nature. So I think the majority leader indicating today that he'll whip that bill and see if there's 60 votes, and if there are 60 votes, he'll put it on the floor. That's a win. Let's do it. And then, as the judge says, let's congratulate. Might even, have a beer.
Bourbon.
Right, a bourbon.
I don't think we need to be drinking beer. Not right now.
And then get back to work.
Well, it sounds like, we've talked about the dignity bill, and I'm hoping that's a catalyst to much more profound change. It sounds like maybe you're saying the First Step Act can be just that, the first step to much more profound change. The White House is involved now. The president has put his position out there, and he sent his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to the Hill to advocate for the bill. You've been involved. You've been engaged with the White House. Give us a little bit of the inside baseball. What do you see from the White House? Where are they on this issue and the issue more globally?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm not here to promote for one president over another or anything like that. But I will tell you that I've been doing this for, about a decade, and Jared Kushner and his team are some of the most sincere, devoted, hardworking, in the weeds kind of people in this area that I have ever experienced. I had 2 phone calls today with the White House, and I have, I would say, any given week, 2 or 3 phone calls with Jared Kushner himself and his team on specific language, on specific members of Congress, on ways in which the bill can be, we can navigate through and get this done. What will this do if we make this change, and how do the federal statutes interact? And it's pushed me to my limits, which is not saying that much, but my intellectual limits, they've pushed, and I've had roughly almost 10 meetings at the White House, some of them real quick and meeting with his team, other times with Jared and with law enforcement and with Urban League and with, the ACLU. Everybody has been invited into the tent, and, I look at what folks like Van Jones and others who have said, now is not the time to get political. Now is the time, because there are families that are in need of this and it's so overdue. Now is the time for us to bridge those political gaps and come together. And I'm here to tell you, there's very little in Congress right now that you have both sides actually talking about anything. And they're talking about substance. And I've always said, when I left my job as temporarily as an assistant U.S. attorney and I went on the Hill, I thought it was the biggest mistake I'd ever made in my life. I thought Washington, D.C. was the place of, a million possibilities, but no real opportunities. And it was, nobody wanted to really do anything. But once they got on the substance of something, it was surprising to see how you set aside the sort of the political game and you started to say, well, what about this? Is there really value in a 35-year mandatory minimum as opposed to 15? Did you really get a lot of value between 15 and 35? Well, let's analyze it. Let's look at it. When Shalom Rubashkin, the rabbi that was sentenced to 27 years for a bank fraud crime, myself and a judge, Judge Paul Cassell, wrote about it, that it was a longer sentence than several terrorists, hijackers of a plane would get. You could just run the gamut. And it told us that minds could come together that were politically different and talk about the substance. And before long, you were trying to figure out how to get solutions, like Representative Jeffries, and you see what they were doing. They were talking about the issues and the substance of the issues, and that's where I hope we go.
Congressman Chaffetz, former member of Congress, former member of the Judiciary Committee, now Fox News contributor. What led you to be one of the initial co-sponsors, one of the initial sponsors of criminal justice reform? Why is this important to you?
So thanks so much for having me, to the dean and to the university and all of you that have sponsored this. Thank you, Holly, and thank you for having me here. I was 16 years in the local business community. I was a marketing and communications person. I was not an attorney. And yet, it's a long story, but I found myself working for John Huntsman. John Huntsman was running to be the next governor of Utah, and he won, and he asked me to stay on as his chief of staff. And I did something I think was very smart when we started. I said, the governor-to-be, what are the 10 things that worry you most? You're going to be a new governor, I'm going to be the new chief of staff. Dave, tell me the 10 things. And right near the top of his list is, I know nothing about the prisons. What if there's a riot? What if there's somebody breaking out? What if there's an execution coming up? I don't know anything about the prisons. And to his credit, we went down and spent a lot of time at the Department of Corrections. And I kept going back and working with them in that state system. And along the way, it suddenly dawned on me, okay, so it's the Department of Corrections. You're showing me how you incarcerate people, how you provide a dentist. You're showing me that you want to build a new building. You're showing me you need, help with compensation for the people that are guarding the place. I understand all that. But what are we doing to actually correct? If it's the Department of Corrections, what are we doing there? And it is a very shallow and insignificant answer. It's really not much. Now, fast forward, I get to Congress. John Boehner is the Speaker of the House. I'm a new member. And somehow I got on Judiciary Committee. And I said, I'm not an attorney. He said, exactly. We need people that are not attorneys to be on the Judiciary. Well, it was pretty well known that if you go on the crime subcommittee, you can't raise a lot of money. And I won my race by a lot, and I volunteered. I said, I want to get involved in the crime subcommittee. That was an easy ask because I got placed in there. Because not many members, I'm being honest here, don't want to go on there because you can't raise any money against it. They all want to be on the IP subcommittee. Intellectual property, that's where you raise money. And everybody was begging to be on there. I found myself on this subcommittee, and then you have just a handful of people who I think were very genuinely interested in solving this problem. Now, I looked at this from more of a business angle. That was my background. What you find when you look at the Department of Justice, more than 1/3 of the budget, 110,000 or so employees, more than 1/3 of the budget goes to the Bureau of Prisons. Think about that. They have FBI, they've got DEA, they've got the U.S. Marshals. You got this whole agency out there, and 1/3 of the budget, and the fastest growing part of their budget is the Bureau of Prisons. We spend about $33,000 to $36,000 a year to incarcerate one person. That's a lot of money. And so we start looking at the system and how it works. And by the way, the overwhelming majority of people that are incarcerated in this country, they're in the state systems. They're not in the federal system. It's roughly about 225,000 people, correct me if I'm wrong, that are in the federal system. The state of Texas has about that many alone. Okay, so you extrapolate that out. I bumped into Brett Tolman. We knew each other ahead of time. But he and another guy named Greg, we started talking this through, and I heard about these horrific cases, the rabbi, I heard about these other things, and Brett, I think more than anybody for me, had a good vision on how we simply tackle this. In his time in the Senate, working with the Senate Judiciary, and I'm like, I'm all in, let's go do it. And I found some very willing partners that were willing to do this on the other side. Hakeem Jeffries is one, Cory Booker's another one. There are a lot of good people on both sides of the aisle. You'd be shocked to see Democratic congressmen and senators coming to the Capitol Hill Club, the Republican place where we have dinner, where there'd be 10 or 12 of us talking about criminal justice reform. And that was happening time and time and time again. To his credit, I will tell you the most bipartisan, I was elected at the same time as Barack Obama. I left shortly after he left. I will give credit to Barack Obama, to the president. The most bipartisan thing that I ever saw that he did was criminal justice reform. Multiple times in the White House, having discussions, people on both sides of the aisle. It didn't get a lot of attention. But we were making some slow progress. We got caught up in a little aspect that kind of blew it up. And, we'll get into the details later. Brett and others will tell you about that. But we were making real progress. And what I felt passionate to do is a couple of things. We had two things that I actually introduced. One was the bill that is now transformed and gotten better under Doug Collins. That was one bill. But the other bill that doesn't get enough attention that we all should be talking about, that Holly should be hauling and screaming about a little bit more, is to change the name from the Bureau of Prisons to the Department of Corrections. Every single state, it's the Department of Corrections, except the federal system. And I just felt strongly that they needed attitude adjustment. They're not there just to incarcerate people. What we should be doing as a people and a population is, what is the goal? What does the end look like? You want to reduce the rate of recidivism. And listen to what Brett was telling you. More than 95% of the people that are going to prison are coming back out. Are they going to be better criminals, or are they going to be better members of society? And what is it that we have to do in order to reduce that rate of recidivism? And it ends up that places like Texas and others have a model that says if you participate in religious services, like genuinely do that, if you participate in the work program at the prison, that's a pretty good indication. If you're furthering your education, that's a huge part of it. So many of these people have a 4th and 5th grade education. Let's go get their GED. Let's invest in that as a community, as a state, as a federal government. Let's spend money against that, because that's way cheaper than the $33,000 to $36,000 is going to take to keep them there if they come back. And the other thing is, how do they behave? And if they're going to behave better, we really do think there should be a light at the end of the tunnel to say, you behave well, you're going to go home. You miss your girlfriend? Guess what? You got to behave well. Demonstrate that you can do that, and there are other things that we can do with ankle bracelets and others that are a fraction of that cost. So that made a lot of sense. Now, I could talk more on the Republican side of the aisle, but I can tell you, Newt Gingrich is very in favor of this. There's this Right on Crime organization that's out there saying, hey, the right end of the political spectrum is going to do this. Grover Norquist looks at it from the financial side. For Republicans, it's the financial side of the thing that makes a lot of sense, but also the family side of it.